They pay me a fortune to work in a metal coffin 600 feet beneath the waves. But the money isn't for the danger of the pressure, it's for the silence. It's a fee for knowing what to do when that all-consuming silence starts whispering your name. They don't tell you that in the contract. They don't tell you about the things that swim in the dark. They just give you a list of rules and pray you have the sense to follow them. My world, for 28 days at a time, is a precisely engineered steel tube measuring 20 feet in length and 8 feet in diameter. In the technical manuals, it's a saturation chamber. The crews, with a gallows humor unique to this profession, call it the can. Inside, the atmosphere is a carefully calibrated cocktail of helium and oxygen, a mixture that keeps our bodies acclimatized to the crushing pressure of the deep sea. It also has the amusing side effect of turning our voices into the high-pitched squeaks of cartoon chipmunks, a constant, absurd reminder of how unnatural our existence is down here. The air carries a permanent, sterile tang of recycled metal, ozone from the CO2 scrubbers, and the faint, unsettling smell of hot electronics. Every surface is cold, functional steel. Every sound is magnified. The constant low hum of the life support system, the gentle hiss of ventilation, the loud clank of a dropped tool. It is an environment of profound and absolute isolation, a tiny bubble of life suspended in a realm more alien and unforgiving than the vacuum of space. My official job title is Deep Sea Cable Repair Technician, a designation that conjures images of high-tech precision. The reality is far grittier. I am a plumber for the glowing arteries of global communication, performing delicate surgery on fiber optic lines in a world of total darkness and unimaginable pressure. My sole companion in this pressurized purgatory is Marcus. He's a relic from a different era of diving, a man whose face is a roadmap of deep creases and whose eyes hold the quiet, haunted weariness of someone who has spent 2 decades staring into a void that normal men will never comprehend. He's on his final contract, a fact he announces with the regularity of a ticking clock. 20 years, Leo, he'd say, his voice a reedy hum in the heliox. 20 years of breathing this canned air and forgetting what a real sunset looks like. 1 more month and I'm cashing out. Going to buy a little boat, find a sunny spot in the Caribbean, and never go deeper than the local swimming pool. In my first few cycles, I found his relentless countdown irritating, a drain on morale. But after 6 months of this life, the monotonous routine, the sensory deprivation, the constant low-grade thrum of existential dread, I was beginning to understand his desperation for the sun. The cycle is a soul-crushing metronome. Wake up to the buzz of an alarm. Force down a tube of nutrient paste that has the consistency of library glue and the flavor of chalk. Wriggle into a multi-million-dollar atmospheric diving suit, the ADS, which feels less like a piece of equipment and more like a personal submarine you wear. Then, the bell lowers you into the black. Outside the viewport, there is nothing. Not darkness in the way surface dwellers understand it, an absence of light. This is a physical presence, a solid, liquid firmament that swallows the powerful beams of your headlamps just a few dozen feet from your faceplate. Your world shrinks to the cone of artificial light you project, a tiny stage on which you perform your duties. Within that cone, there is the work, the meticulous, focused task of aligning filaments finer than a human hair, while your bulky gloved hands fumble with precision tools. Beyond that cone, there is only the abyss. The silence is the most defining feature. It is a living entity, a pressure on your eardrums and your psyche. The only sounds are your own, the loud mechanical rasp of your rebreather, the thumping of your own heart, the occasional static crackle from the comms link to the bell. You learn to treat that bubble of sound as a sanctuary. You learn to dread any noise that doesn't originate from you or your equipment. It was on the 3rd day of our current 28-day sentence that the metronome of routine finally faltered. We were in the cramped antechamber, going through the familiar ritualistic process of pre-dive checks. I was sealing the gaskets on my suit, my mind running through the technical specifications of the splice I was about to perform. Marcus was unusually quiet, his movements stiff and hesitant. His hands, which I had seen perform miraculous repairs in near-zero visibility, carried a distinct tremor. He paused, his gaze fixed on me, his eyes dark and unreadable. "You've got a knack for this, Leo," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You're quick on the uptake, you trust the engineering, that's good." I felt a flush of pride, a rare morsel of validation in this sterile environment. "Thanks, Marcus. Just trying to do the job right. Get paid, get home to Sarah, and maybe fix that leaky roof." He offered a weak, mirthless smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The job isn't just about the engineering," he said, his voice dropping lower. "The pressure, the isolation, it does things to a man's mind. They call it HPNS, high-pressure nervous syndrome. But that's not the whole story. There are things down here, Leo. Things that were old when the mountains were young. Things the sonar doesn't paint and the cameras don't see." I let out a high-pitched laugh, the heliox turning my amusement into a ridiculous squeal. "Come on, old-timer. Don't start with the spooky sea stories. Next you'll be telling me about mermaids and krakens." The look on his face wiped the smile from mine. There was no humor in his expression, only a profound and chilling seriousness. He reached into the inner pocket of his worn jumpsuit and extracted a folded piece of paper. It was dog-eared and soft with age, its creases ingrained with years of grime, and what looked suspiciously like dried blood. He carefully unfolded it and held it out to me. "The company provides a 300-page safety manual covering every possible equipment failure," he said. "This is the only page that will actually keep you alive. It gets passed down from one generation of divers to the next, the ones who make it back anyway." I took the paper. The text was typewritten on an old machine, the letters faint and slightly uneven. At the top, a single stark title: "The Rules." I began to read, a feeling of condescending bemusement washing over me. "If you hear rhythmic tapping on your helmet, ignore it. It is not thermal contraction of the metal. It is not a system malfunction. Do not react. Do not acknowledge it in any way. It is a test. It will grow bored and move on. Your sonar tracker and your instruments are your only sources of truth. If you see lights in the distance that do not appear on your screen, they are not another vessel. They are not a rescue team. They are lures. Do not investigate. Do not follow. The darkness at the periphery of your light is not empty space. It will sometimes take shapes, familiar silhouettes, fleeting movements. These are impressions. Do not look directly at them. The darkness is shy, but it does not like to be stared at. If your communication system crackles with unexpected static, and you hear a voice you recognize, a spouse, a parent, a child, it is a sophisticated echo. It is a signal bleed. If you answer it, you are giving it a piece of you it can use. Do not, under any circumstances, respond." I looked up at Marcus, my skepticism battling with the unnerving conviction in his eyes. "You can't be serious, Mark. This is folklore. Superstition born from too much time in the can." He snatched the paper back with a surprising quickness, folding it with the reverence of a priest handling a sacred text. "I believe in breathing," he rasped. "I've seen men, good men, sharp engineers, better divers than you'll ever be, get hauled up to the surface with their suits perfectly intact, but their eyes wide with a terror that stopped their hearts. They didn't follow the rules. The rest of the suiting up process was completed in a heavy, unnerving silence." I tried to dismiss his words. I was a man of logic, of quantifiable data and physical laws. I trusted my training. I trusted my multi-million-dollar suit. I did not trust ghost stories. An hour later, I was descending from the bell, a solitary figure in the crushing, infinite night. 650 feet of water pressed down on my suit, a weight so immense it was difficult to comprehend. My umbilical, a thick bundle of cables and breathing gas hoses, snaked back up to the bell. My only connection to the world of the living. My headlamps bored a tunnel of brilliant white light through the blackness, illuminating the colossal armored cable that lay on the seabed, like the spine of some long-dead leviathan. The water was filled with a constant, gentle snowfall of organic detritus, marine snow, drifting through my beam, the only visible movement in this sterile, timeless world. I landed softly on the muddy floor and got to work. The task was complex, demanding my full concentration as I began prepping a damaged repeater unit. The silence wrapped around me like a shroud, and then I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was crisp and clear, seemingly coming from the back of my helmet, right behind my head. It was perfectly rhythmic, deliberate. A cold spike of adrenaline shot through my chest. The first rule screamed in my mind: it is not thermal contraction. My heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I froze, my gauntleted hand hovering inches from the repeater housing. My rational mind kicked into overdrive, scrambling for an explanation. A loose valve on my bailout tank, a piece of debris kicked up by my thrusters tapping against the helmet. It had to be something mundane, it had to be. I forced myself to remain still, to focus on the sound of my own breathing. I did not turn. I did not speak. I did not acknowledge it. The tapping continued for what felt like an eternity, a patient, persistent, questioning sound. Tap, tap, tap. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence that rushed back in was somehow heavier, more profound than before. A wave of relief, so powerful it left me lightheaded, washed over me. It was nothing. Just my nerves, the pressure, the old man's stories getting into my head. I took a deep, shuddering breath and returned to my work, forcefully pushing the incident from my thoughts. The remainder of the shift passed without incident, but the comfortable solitude I once cherished was gone. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt expectant. The darkness no longer felt vacant. It felt watchful. Later that day, during my second excursion from the bell, my newfound unease was validated. This time, it wasn't a sound. It was a glimpse of motion, a flicker, right on the absolute edge of my vision, where the brilliant white of my lamp surrendered to the all-consuming black. It was impossibly large and moved with a fluid, serpentine grace that defied the crushing pressure. Far too big to be a giant squid, too fast to be a submersible. My head instinctively snapped up, my eyes straining to penetrate the gloom. There was nothing there, just the endless, swirling blizzard of marine snow. Rule number 3, do not look directly at them. My logical mind fought back. A hallucination. HPNS. You're sleep-deprived, you're stressed, but the engineer in me, the part of my brain that needed to see, to analyze, to understand, was a far more powerful force. I had to know. It was an act of pure, unadulterated hubris. I made the conscious decision to break the rule. I turned my entire body slowly, deliberately sweeping the powerful beam of my headlamp in a wide arc, painting the seabed with light. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing. Absolutely nothing. Only the barren, muddy expanse and the distant, looming shape of a small underwater ridge. A profound sense of foolishness washed over me, mixed with a surge of anger at Marcus for planting these paranoid seeds in my mind. "See?" I whispered to myself, the helium in my voice making me sound like a petulant child. "There's nothing there. You're cracking up, Leo." It was in that precise moment of self-congratulatory rationalism that my comm system, which had been silent and clear, emitted a soft burst of static. It was a barely audible hiss, lasting no more than a second. But through that hiss, riding on that wave of white noise, came a sound that instantly froze the blood in my veins. It was a single word, spoken in a voice that I knew better than my own heartbeat. It was the voice of my wife, Sarah. A voice that should have been 1,000 miles and a world away, on the surface, in the sun. It was impossibly clear, impossibly close, as if she were whispering directly into my ear. And it spoke my name, Leo. It wasn't a question or a call. It was a simple, calm, terrifying statement of fact. Returning to the can was a blur. I remember the bell docking, the hiss of equalization, but my mind was a screaming void. I stripped off the ADS with trembling, uncooperative hands, the complex procedure of detaching umbilicals and sealing ports happening on pure muscle memory. I stumbled out into the main living chamber, my skin clammy, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Marcus was sitting at the small fold-down table, a steaming mug of rehydrated coffee in his hands. He took one long, slow look at my face, at the chalk-white pallor, the sheen of cold sweat, the raw terror in my eyes. He didn't need to ask what had happened. He didn't ask what I saw. He didn't ask what I heard. He simply lowered his mug to the table with a soft click. his old, tired eyes filled not with surprise, but with a terrible, knowing sadness. He let out a long, weary sigh, a sound of profound defeat. "You looked, didn't you?" That was the first time I knowingly broke one of the rules. It was the first time I understood that they weren't suggestions. It was the moment I realized that I had done something far worse than make a mistake. I had answered a question I hadn't even heard being asked. I had signaled my presence to the things that swam in the dark, and now the darkness was looking back. If you want to discover the other rules on that list, and if you have the nerve to find out what happens when the abyss knows your name, then subscribe to this channel and hit the like button, because you are not going to want to miss what came crawling out of that darkness next. The silence that followed Marcus's question was a physical entity, more oppressive than the 300 atmospheres of seawater pressing in on our steel sanctuary. It was a thick, viscous silence that seemed to deaden the ever-present hum of the life support systems, leaving only the frantic, high-pitched thrumming of my own heart in the helium-rich air. His words, "You looked, didn't you?" were not an accusation. They were a final, damning judgment. They were the sound of a door slamming shut on the rational, predictable world I had inhabited my entire life. The chilling residue of the dive, the phantom touch of Sarah's voice in my ear, clung to me like the deep-sea cold. I stood there, dripping water onto the grated floor, my body trembling with a violent, uncontrollable post-adrenaline shudder. I desperately wanted to lash out, to scream at him, to dismiss him as a senile old man whose mind had finally cracked under the strain, whose morbid superstitions had found a fertile breeding ground in my own exhaustion. But I couldn't. The crystalline perfection of that auditory hallucination, the intimate and flawless recreation of my wife's voice, defied all logical explanation. It wasn't a memory, it was a violation. "What was it, Marcus?" I finally managed to choke out, my voice a pathetic squeak. "What the hell is out there?" He flinched, a sharp, violent recoil, as if my very question was a summons, a blasphemy that could compromise the integrity of the hull. He shook his head, his gaze falling to the scarred and pitted surface of the metal table, refusing to meet mine. "There's no what," he whispered, his own voice raspy and thin. "There's no name for it. There's just is. There's just out there. Think of it this way, Leo. We are intruders in a house that has been dark and quiet for millennia. We are noisy, clumsy guests who have strung our glowing, buzzing wires through their silent halls. The rules, they aren't for our safety, not in the way the company thinks. They're a code of conduct, a list of etiquette. They are how we try to be polite, uninteresting, and fundamentally unnoticeable, so the ancient host doesn't feel the need to greet us." His knuckles wrapped around his coffee mug were bone white. "You hear the tapping on your helmet, you ignore it. It's a curious knock on the bedroom door. If you don't answer, they assume the room is empty and move on. You see strange lights in the gloom, you turn away. It's a child dangling a shiny piece of glass. If you don't give it your attention, it grows bored. But looking is an acknowledgement. It's a formal introduction. And answering," he trailed off, a visible shudder racking his thin frame. "Answering is handing them the key to your room." "A key for what?" I pressed, my voice escalating with a raw, desperate hysteria that felt utterly alien. What did I let in? What did I invite? He finally raised his head, and in the harsh, unforgiving light of the chamber, I saw an emotion in his eyes that went far beyond simple weariness. It was a deep, primal and ancient terror, the haunted look of an animal that has smelled the predator on the wind and knows there is no escape. "You've been on this contract for 6 months, kid," he said, his voice flat and dead. "You've seen the crew rotations. Guys who are perfectly fine one cycle, then refuse to dive the next, quitting on the spot. You've read the official incident reports. Catastrophic equipment malfunction. Critical diver error. Acute deep-water psychosis. How many of those do you honestly think are the whole truth?" He pushed himself to his feet, his movements as stiff and brittle as an old man's. "The corporation knows. Not the specifics, maybe, but they know this territory isn't empty. They just factor it in as an acceptable operational loss. Our contracts are filled with clauses about psychological stability and pre-existing conditions, aren't they? That's their legal parachute. Anything inexplicable happens, We're just another tragic case of a diver cracking under the immense pressure. It's a cleaner narrative for the insurance underwriters." He would say no more. He turned his back on me, retreating into a stony, impenetrable shell of silence, effectively marooning me. I was adrift in a pressurized cell with a confirmed monster outside the door and a man who refused to tell me its name. My isolation was now absolute. The following 48 hours were a slow descent into a very personal hell. We operated with the grim, silent efficiency of two men who knew a fatal secret. The cramped confines of the can became a pressure cooker for my paranoia. Every groan of the hull under the immense strain of the sea was a footstep. Every hiss of the ventilation was a whisper. Sleep became an enemy, a state of vulnerability I feared more than the crushing blackness outside. I would lie in my bunk, my eyes wide open in the dim light, tracing the welds on the ceiling and listening. Just listening. For a tap. For a voice. For anything. The nutrient paste I squeezed into my mouth tasted of ash. The recycled air felt thin and useless in my lungs. My world had shrunk to this steel tube, and the universe outside it was filled with a single malevolent intelligence that now knew my name. If Marcus was a locked door, then I would have to find my own key. During my designated rest cycles, when Marcus was in a deep medicated slumber, I turned to the only other window out of this prison, the onboard computer terminal. It was a relic of a machine, its casing yellowed and cracked, its connection to the surface a data trickle that was an insult to the very fiber optic cables we were maintaining. The system was heavily firewalled, designed to keep divers like me confined to mission-critical data. But my life before this one, a life of chasing invoices and debugging code for ungrateful clients, had taught me a thing or two about navigating digital labyrinths. I began to probe, to search for a way into the station's deeper memory banks. I worked with a feverish intensity, my hands flying across the grimy keyboard, one ear always tuned to the sound of Marcus stirring in his bunk. It was a slow, painstaking process, but finally, after what felt like an eternity, I found a loophole, a forgotten diagnostic port in the system's architecture. I slipped through, and there, buried under layers of security protocols, I found the directory. It was labeled with a cold bureaucratic finality: incident archives, decommissioned assets, for archival review only. It was a digital mausoleum. What I found inside was the raw, unvarnished truth that Marcus had hinted at. The official reports were sanitized fictions. Here were the unfiltered mission logs, the complete unedited audio from the divers' comms, the continuous, second-by-second biometric data streamed from their suits right up until the moment of transmission loss. And there in the cold, hard data was the pattern. The accidents weren't random. They clustered around specific geological features: abyssal trenches, hydrothermal vent fields, and deep-sea ridges, places where the Earth was thin, where the deep ocean met the planet's molten heart. And the audio logs, listening to them was an act of self-torture. They were raw testaments to final moments of sanity-shattering terror. I spent hours meticulously filtering the static, amplifying the gain, piecing together fragments. I heard a Russian diver named Petrov in 1998, his voice calm at first, then rising to a panicked shriek. The bioluminescent particles, they are not random. They are spelling my daughter's name. Anya. How can they be spelling Anya? I found the log of a Japanese engineer named Chen from 2005. David is outside the bell. He is waving at me. But David died in the decompression accident last year. It's wearing David's face, but the suit is all wrong. The evidence was undeniable and terrifying. The phenomenon was not a mindless predator. It was an intelligence. It learned. It probed the minds of its victims, extracting their deepest loves and fears, and then it meticulously crafted a personalized nightmare to break them. My next dive was no longer a job. It was a journey into enemy territory. The familiar weight of the ADS on my shoulders was no longer reassuring. It was the suffocating embrace of a casket. The darkness outside my faceplate was no longer empty. It was a living, breathing entity, and I had its undivided attention. The task was routine, a simple diagnostic on a signal amplifier. As I worked, my movements clumsy and jerky, I saw my own reflection in the amplifier's polished chrome housing. For a single heart-stopping moment, the face that stared back from within the helmet was not my own. It was a skeletal, emaciated thing, its skin translucent and pale, its eyes vast, black, empty pits. Its mouth was open in a silent, eternal scream. I cried out, a strangled gasp, and threw myself backward, the image shattering like broken glass, replaced instantly by the reflection of my own horrified face. A hallucination, the pressure, it's getting to you. But even as I tried to rationalize it, the comms crackled, that soft, insidious hiss, and then a voice. Not Sarah's, not this time. It was my father's voice. My father, who had died of cancer a decade ago. It spoke a word I hadn't heard since I was a small boy, a secret nickname he'd given me during a camping trip when he'd taught me the constellations. Starlight. The sound of that word, in that impossibly gentle, loving tone, in this God-forsaken place of crushing pressure and eternal night, was a psychological blow from which I knew I would never recover. It wasn't just in my ear. I felt it resonate in my skull. This thing wasn't just listening to me, it was reading me. A desperate, animalistic need for answers propelled me back to the terminal. I wasn't just looking for patterns anymore, I was hunting for a weakness, an explanation, anything. I focused my search on a single case, Alistair Finch, a British diver who vanished in this very sector in 2011. The official report was a textbook case of negligence, catastrophic failure of the rebreather's CO2 scrubbers. But his final audio log was an anomaly. It was nearly 30 minutes long, far longer than most. The majority of it was just the steady, rhythmic sound of his breathing and the low hum of his suit's environmental systems. I listened to it for hours, straining to hear anything else. Then, in the final 2 minutes, something changed. A new sound began to fade in, almost subliminal, woven beneath the sound of his breathing. It took every ounce of my skill with the terminal's archaic audio filtering software to isolate it. It was music. A soft, hauntingly beautiful melody, like a mother humming a lullaby to her child. Then Finch's voice, no longer calm, but stretched taut with a terror that felt chillingly immediate. "It's inside my head," he whispered, his voice cracking. "She won't stop singing inside my head." There was a long pause, filled only by his sharp, ragged breaths, and then his final words. They were spoken with a sudden, horrifying clarity, as if the connection had momentarily become perfect, as if he were whispering a final, urgent secret directly to me across the gulf of years. The final rule, the one they don't write down. It's a lie. It's not for our protection, it's for... The transmission didn't just cut to static. It ended. It ended with a sharp, sickeningly wet cracking sound, like a thick tree branch being snapped in a storm, followed by an immediate, perfect, and eternal silence. The sound I had unearthed from Alistair Finch's final moments became the new, horrifying soundtrack to my existence. That wet, cracking noise, the sound of a life being abruptly extinguished, played on a continuous loop in the echo chamber of my skull. It was the punctuation mark at the end of his whispered warning, a warning that now felt like a personal inheritance. Sleep was no longer a refuge. It was a state of surrender I could not afford. I would lie in my bunk, eyes burning from exhaustion, and listen. I listened to the rhythmic sigh of the CO2 scrubbers, the low-frequency hum of the hull straining against the colossal pressure, and I tried to discern a pattern, a message in the cacophony. The close quarters of the can, once a mere inconvenience, had transformed into a psychological crucible. Marcus's silence was a living presence, a wall of quiet judgment and shared terror that was more unnerving than any scream. He moved with a leaden, exhausted deliberation, his eyes perpetually fixed on some distant point beyond the curved steel walls, as if he were already a ghost. The unspoken truth of what we were dealing with hung between us, thick and suffocating, poisoning the recycled air we breathed. I couldn't live with it. The not knowing, the ambiguity, was a corrosive acid eating away at the foundations of my sanity. I had to force the issue. I had to breach the conspiracy of silence. During a scheduled systems check with the surface, while Marcus was in the dive prep chamber, I made my move. I bypassed the standard operational channel, using a maintenance access code I'd found during my digital spelunking to open a direct, encrypted voice link to the topside mission supervisor, a man named Davison. His voice, when it finally answered, was exactly as I had imagined, smooth, professional, and utterly devoid of warmth. "This is Davison. This is an unscheduled, non-standard channel diver. Report." My heart hammered against my ribs. My throat was dry. "This is Leo Bishop, ADS-1, I said, my helium-tinged voice sounding feeble and ridiculous. "I need to report a series of non-standard operational phenomena." I laid it all out in a frantic, desperate torrent of words. I told him about the tapping. I told him about the visual anomalies, the voice of my wife, the voice of my dead father. I told him about my investigation into the archives, about the patterns of disappearances, about the chilling similarities in the final audio logs. I finished by telling him about Alistair Finch's last words, about the warning that was cut short by that sickening final sound. I threw all my cards on the table, expecting, I don't know what I expected. Shock? Concern? An emergency evacuation order? What I received was a carefully measured, almost bored silence. When Davison finally spoke, his voice was laced with a condescending, clinical pity. "Diver Bishop," he began, his tone that of a doctor addressing a particularly delusional patient. "You have been at depth for 22 days. You're approaching the critical window for elevated psychological stress. What you're describing are classic textbook symptoms of high-pressure nervous syndrome combined with sensory deprivation. Auditory and visual artifacts are not uncommon. The mind, Leo, is a pattern-seeking machine. In an environment devoid of stimuli, it will create its own." "This wasn't a hallucination," I insisted, my voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. "Finch's audio log, the sound at the end. The Finch file is sealed for a reason," Davison cut in, his voice hardening, losing its patronizing edge and taking on a sharp, metallic authority. "That recording contains audio corruption due to a catastrophic failure of the diver's primary breathing apparatus. What you're interpreting as a sound is nothing more than the sound of equipment failing under extreme pressure. Your investigation into decommissioned archives is a serious breach of protocol, Bishop. I strongly suggest you focus on your assigned duties and cease these extracurricular activities." He was gaslighting me, using the cold, impenetrable jargon of the corporation as a shield. He was telling me I was crazy. "Marcus knows," I blurted out, a desperate final gambit. "He gave me the list of rules. He knows what's out here." Another pause, this one colder, more calculated. "Marcus is a fine diver," Davison said slowly, "but he is at the end of a long and taxing career. We have his full psychological profile on file. I'm noting in your own file that you are exhibiting signs of acute paranoia and are potentially being influenced by a senior colleague suffering from age-related cognitive decline. Now I am ordering you to get a minimum of 8 hours of medicated rest. We will schedule a full psych evaluation for you the moment you return to the surface. Until then, you will perform your duties as assigned, and you will not speak of this again. Do you understand me, Leo? The threat was not veiled. It was laid bare. My career, my reputation, my very sanity was being called into question. I was being boxed in, labeled as unreliable, my testimony preemptively discredited. The company wasn't an ally. It was the groundskeeper of the abyss, and its only concern was ensuring the silence of the graveyard was not disturbed. I understood. The conspiracy was real, and I was on the wrong side of the wall. My next dive was a descent into a new layer of hell. The thing in the dark knew it had been seen. It knew it had been heard. The games were over. The subtlety was gone. The threat now became direct, malicious, and terrifyingly intelligent. It began to play with the comms. As I was performing a delicate recalibration on a junction box, Davison's voice would crackle in my ear, crisp and authoritative. "Bishop, run a diagnostic on bypass valve 3, now." I would move to comply, only for Marcus's voice to immediately cut in from the bell. "Leo, what are you doing? The bypass valve is stable. You need to adjust the signal gain like we discussed." My head would spin. Who was real? Who was the mimic? I would check the mission orders on my wrist-mounted display, only to see a completely different instruction. The entity was using the voices of my superiors, my partners, creating a symphony of contradictory commands designed to sow chaos and erode my trust in my own senses. My most critical tool for safety and coordination, the communication link, had been turned into a weapon of psychological warfare. Then came the new mission. Davison's voice, the real one this time I thought, came over the main channel, cold and official. A primary trunk line, one of the main data arteries running across the Atlantic, had gone completely dead. No signal, no feedback, nothing. The location was in a sector we had not yet explored, a full 200 feet deeper than our current operational depth. It was a place the company called the Hadal Zone Transition. The pressure would be exponentially greater, the environment more extreme. It didn't feel like a routine assignment. It felt like a punishment. It felt like I was being sent into exile. The descent in the diving bell was agonizing. The structure groaned and creaked around us, the sounds of a vessel under a strain it was never truly designed for. Marcus was a statue of terrified rigidity beside me, his knuckles white where he gripped the safety rail. I could feel the increased pressure in my bones, a dense, suffocating weight that seemed to compress my very soul. When we finally reached the seabed, the landscape was different. The soft, silty floor of our previous location was gone, replaced by a jagged volcanic terrain of black, basaltic rock that rose up in twisted, unnatural spires. It looked like a petrified forest from a nightmare. Our headlamps seemed weaker here, the darkness more profound, more absolute, as if it possessed a tangible quality that actively devoured light. We left the bell, our powerful thruster packs the only thing preventing us from plummeting into the chasms that crisscrossed the seafloor. We followed the signal tracker towards the location of the downed cable, and then we saw it. The cable was as thick as my thigh, a marvel of engineering sheathed in layers of steel wire, copper, and polyethylene, designed to withstand sharks, anchors, and the colossal pressure of the deep. It had not been cleanly cut. It looked like it had been savaged. The armored casing was shredded, peeled back in long, curling strips of metal, revealing the delicate fiber-optic core beneath. And scored deep into the steel itself were immense parallel grooves, each as wide as my arm. They were not the marks of any tool or submersible. They were the marks of claws. Claws of an impossible size, wielded with a force that defied comprehension. We hovered there in stunned silence, the only sound the frantic rasp of our own breathing. This was not a malfunction. This was an attack. As I circled the catastrophic damage, my light swept across the debris field. A small object, half buried in the black volcanic sand, reflected the beam with a dull glint. My curiosity overriding my fear, I drifted down and used a manipulator arm to gently brush away the silt. It was a small rectangular piece of metal, greened with age and corrosion, but the engravings were still legible. It was a diver's identification tag, standard issue from about a decade and a half ago, and on it, 2 lines of text that made the freezing water around me feel even colder. The first line was a name, Alistair Finch. The second was a date, the official date of his disappearance. This was his grave. The audio log was real. The warning was real. And whatever had done this to the cable was the same thing that had silenced him. I held the tag in my manipulator, a cold piece of metal that felt heavier than a tombstone. And it was in that exact moment, as the reality of our situation crashed down upon me, that the light appeared. Far out in the impenetrable darkness, where there should have been nothing but the void, a single brilliant point of light blinked into existence. It was not the diffuse glow of bioluminescence. It was a sharp, artificial light, a beacon. Then it began to blink, a slow, deliberate, and universally understood pattern. ... dash, 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 ... SOS, a cry for help, a direct, blatant, and terrifying violation of rule number 2. My blood turned to ice. My eyes were locked on the blinking light, my mind screaming at me to look away, to retreat to the bell. But then the comms crackled to life. It was Davison's voice, but it was imbued with a calm, almost cheerful reassurance that was profoundly jarring. "Leo, Marcus, we have good news," the voice said, smooth as silk. We've managed to divert the deep-sea vehicle Pathfinder from the adjacent sector to provide assistance. They've just come into visual range of your position. We need you to follow their beacon to the designated rendezvous point. Acknowledge and proceed to the light source, gentlemen." My head whipped around to look at Marcus. He was shaking, a violent, full-body tremor that was visible even through the bulk of his suit. He wasn't looking at the light. He was staring at me, his eyes behind his faceplate wide with a frantic, pleading terror that transcended the need for words. He shook his head, a single, sharp, desperate negative motion. His entire being was a silent scream. No, it's a trap. I was frozen, caught in an impossible crossfire. My eyes saw a universal distress signal. My ears heard a direct logical order from my commanding officer, but my gut and the raw animal terror radiating from the veteran diver beside me told me that to move toward that light was to move toward our own extinction. Time itself seemed to fracture and slow, each second stretching into an agonizing eternity in the abyssal cold. We hung suspended in the water, two insignificant specks of human technology caught in the crushing jaws of an impossible choice. Before me, the blinking beacon pulsed its siren song, a steady, rhythmic SOS that resonated with the very core of my training. It was a universal symbol of distress, a call to aid that was ingrained in me as a fundamental law, as inviolable as gravity. In my ear, the voice of Mission Supervisor Davison, or what I had to assume was Davison, reinforced this law with the cold, hard weight of a direct command. Proceed to the light source. It was the voice of the surface world, of logic, of procedure, of the entire rational framework that had governed my life. It was the voice that signed my paychecks and promised a return to the sun. To disobey it was unthinkable, an act of professional suicide that would brand me as unstable, a coward, or worse. But beside me there was Marcus. I could no longer hear his voice over the comms, which had descended into a low hiss, but his terror was a broadcast on a different, more primal frequency. It was a tangible wave of pure, animalistic dread that radiated through the water, a force more potent than any spoken word. He was shaking his head in a series of short, violent and desperate spasms, his entire body locked in a rictus of negation. His wide, terrified eyes, visible through his faceplate, were locked on mine, pleading with a silent, screaming urgency that bypassed language entirely. No. It's a trap. Remember the rule. My mind had become a battlefield, a no-man's land torn apart by two warring realities. Every instinct I possessed as an engineer, a technician, and a follower of rules screamed at me to obey the command. The Pathfinder was a known asset. Its existence was a verifiable fact. The SOS was a concrete piece of data. Davison's order was a direct link in the chain of command. To refuse was to sever that link, to declare myself insane. And yet, my mind's eye was filled with the ghostly image of Alistair Finch's corroded identification tag, a small metal tombstone for a man who had likely followed his own final, fatal set of orders. My inner ear still echoed with the perfect, impossible fidelity of my wife's voice, a loving caress that had been twisted into a weapon of psychological warfare. And I could not, would not, ignore the raw, unfiltered terror emanating from the 20-year veteran beside me, a man whose survival in this lethal environment was a testament to his understanding of its unwritten laws. The SOS continued its patient, hypnotic pulse, ... .. The voice in my ear, Davison's mimic, grew sharper, its smooth professional veneer cracking to reveal a cold, reptilian impatience. "Bishop, I will not repeat myself again. Your partner is experiencing a severe psychotic episode. He is a liability. Your new directive is to disregard him and proceed to the rendezvous point. Acknowledge. Now." The clinical diagnosis, the instant dismissal of a man's terror as a mere episode, was more chilling than any overt threat. We were not men down here. We were assets, and Marcus had just been reclassified as faulty equipment. My moment of indecision was no longer just a pause, it was a mutiny. It was in that stretched, agonizing silence, my will paralyzed between the world I knew and the nightmare I was discovering, that the choice was violently taken from me. The light stopped blinking. The steady, rhythmic pulse was extinguished, plunging the distant void back into an absolute, featureless black. For a single heart-stopping second, the only light came from our own suits. Then the beacon reappeared, no longer a blinking point of light, but a steady, brilliant, and rapidly approaching beam. It was moving with an unnatural velocity that was fundamentally wrong. I knew the physics of this place. I knew the immense drag, the viscosity of the water at this depth. I knew the slow, powerful grace of a submersible maneuvering with its thrusters. This was not that. This was a sliver of motion, a predatory quickness that seemed to ignore the laws of fluid dynamics. It didn't plow through the water, it sliced through it, propelled by some unseen, silent force. As the light bore down on us, it resolved into the familiar, comforting silhouette of a diver in an atmospheric suit, its headlamp a piercing cone of white in the gloom. But the closer it drew, the more that comforting familiarity curdled into a grotesque parody. The proportions were subtly, disturbingly incorrect. The limbs were elongated, the torso unnaturally slender, giving it a gaunt, skeletal appearance. It moved with a terrifyingly fluid grace, its limbs trailing slightly behind it, as if it were swimming, not being propelled by machinery. There was no visible thruster pack, no umbilical connecting it to a support vessel. The suit itself was an archaic model, a museum piece from decades past, its surface scarred with corrosion and the telltale pitting of long-term submersion. It was a dead thing, a waterlogged corpse reanimated. It was stripped of all professional accoutrements, no manipulator arms, no tool holsters, no diagnostic equipment. It was a featureless, menacing shape, an instrument of pure, focused intent. Marcus finally made a sound, a choked, gurgling cry that was barely human, a sound of a mind breaking. He began to back away frantically, his own thruster controls engaging in clumsy, panicked bursts. The voice of Davison had vanished from my comms, replaced by a low, humming static. The hunter had revealed itself, the trap was sprung. The figure came to a halt approximately 30 feet from us, hovering with an impossible stillness in the water. It was a silent, terrifying sentinel, its headlamp a single unblinking eye. My mind, now stripped bare of all rational explanations, was consumed by a single, burning, and profoundly reckless question. Who are you? My training, the rules, Marcus's terrified face. It all burned away like chaff in a furnace, consumed by a primal, self-destructive need to see the face of my tormentor, to put a human visage on the formless dread that had been hounding me. It was the ultimate act of hubris, the final, fatal curiosity that Marcus had warned me against. With a deliberate, trembling motion that felt as if I were moving through solid rock, I angled my main body thrusters, rotating my entire suit to face the figure head-on. I focused the twin high-intensity beams of my headlamps directly at its faceplate. It was a direct, contemptuous, and absolute violation of the third rule. The darkness is shy, but it does not like to be stared at. What I saw will be forever burned into the soft tissue of my brain, a scar on my soul. It was not a face. It was not a monster with teeth and claws. It was a wound in the fabric of reality. Behind the thick, salt-scored glass of the helmet, there was an utter and absolute nothingness. It was not darkness in the sense of an absence of light, but a tangible, physical void. It was a hole in the universe, a perfect sphere of non-existence, where a human head should be. My powerful lights did not illuminate or reflect off it. They were devoured by it. The beams seemed to bend inwards at the edges and vanish without a trace into that miniature personal black hole. My brain struggled, trying to process an input that defied every law of physics and optics it had ever known. It was like looking at the visual representation of the concept of gone. And from the very center of that light-swallowing void, a voice spoke in my comms. The static was gone, replaced by a perfect high-fidelity clarity that was more obscene than any distortion. It was Sarah's voice, imbued with the soft, gentle, and heartbreakingly familiar warmth of 1,000 cherished memories. "You found me," she whispered, a soft, loving sigh. "I was so worried you'd gotten lost. Why did you take so long to come find me, Leo?" My world did not shatter. It sublimated, turning from a solid state of reality into a gas of pure, unadulterated horror. A scream tore itself from my throat, a high-pitched, helpless shriek that was instantly swallowed by the immense, indifferent pressure. This was not a mimicry. This was not a recording. This was a desecration. It had delved into the most sacred corners of my heart, stolen the most precious sound I knew, and it was now wearing it like a skin, speaking through a hollow space where a man's face should be. In that single, eternal moment of absolute psychological collapse, the entity made its move. It did not lunge. It did not attack. It simply acted. The world went black. Every light on my suit, every glowing LED on my control panel, every single illuminated pixel on my wrist-mounted display died in the same instant. The twin cones of our headlamps vanished, and we were plunged into a darkness so complete, so profound, that the concept of vision ceased to have any meaning. My rebreather unit went silent, the comforting hiss of circulating air gone. The umbilical link to the bell went dead. All power, all life support, all communication was severed. We were adrift, utterly. The only thing left in the universe was the single, malevolent, unwavering beam of light from the entity's helmet, pinning us like terrified moths in its glare. I was blind, deaf, and rapidly suffocating, my lungs already beginning to burn with a desperate, fiery need for the air that was no longer being supplied. A cold, absolute panic seized me, bypassing all thought. But the horror was not yet finished. In the suffocating, silent blackness, I could hear, or rather feel through the dense medium of the water, a new sound. It was a faint, wet, shearing noise, like a hydraulic cutter closing on a thick cable. I heard a muffled gasp from the direction where Marcus had been, a sound that was abruptly, wetly cut short. And then, silence. The frantic, rhythmic sound of his panicked breathing, which had been a desperate counterpoint to my own terror, was simply gone. The silence he left behind was a physical presence, a hole in the world more terrifying than the one inside the helmet. I was completely, utterly, and finally alone, adrift in the eternal night with a thing that had just edited my partner out of existence. An eternity passed in that black, silent, oxygen-starved moment. I was convinced that this was death, that my lungs would burst and the pressure would finally crush my suit into a tiny, dense ball of scrap metal. Then, just as the edges of my consciousness began to fizzle and spark into blackness, a new light bloomed into existence. A dim, weak, and sickly crimson light. The emergency power system. A last resort, a final breath. It had kicked in automatically, activating a single low-powered red lamp on my chest plate and restoring a bare, trickling minimum of life support to my helmet. The world returned, not as it was, but as a hellish, blood-soaked diorama. My rebreather coughed violently back to life, and I took a ragged, desperate, burning gasp of recycled air. My eyes, wide with madness, darted around, trying to reorient myself in the crimson nightmare. The entity was gone. It had vanished as if it had never been there. I turned, my entire body shaking with an uncontrollable palsy, searching for Marcus. But there was only empty, red-tinged water where he had been hovering moments before. His umbilical, his lifeline to the bell and to the world of the living, had been severed. The cut was impossibly clean, so precise it looked as if it had been done with a laser. There was no sign of a struggle, no debris field, no body. He had simply been deleted. A primal reptilian instinct, buried deep in the oldest part of my brain, took over. Flee. I had to get back to the bell. I fumbled with my thruster controls, my gloved fingers feeling like clumsy, useless sausages. I had to get away from this cursed place, away from the ghost of my partner. I turned to propel myself away to escape, and as I turned, the weak red emergency light swept across the savaged, brutalized remains of the deep-sea cable. My blood, already frozen with terror, seemed to crystallize into solid ice in my veins. There, on the shredded metal casing, were new marks that had not been there a moment ago. They were not the deep, violent claw marks I had seen earlier. These were finer, more deliberate, as if they had been etched with the tip of a sharpened nail. Scratched into the surface of the steel, gleaming wetly in the hellish red light, were two simple, devastating words. Your turn before I tell you what was waiting for me in that chamber, before I tell you the end of my story. I need you to do something. Look around the room you're in. Feel the solid floor beneath your feet. Listen to the sounds of the world you think is real. Now I want you to go down to the comments and tell me what you think the truth is. What is the terrible secret behind the rules? What ancient horror did the corporation make a deal with? Theorize, guess, write it all down. Get it out of your system, because I promise you, whatever you think you know, whatever nightmare you can possibly conjure, the reality is so much worse. The truth isn't that there's a monster in the dark. The truth is that the darkness has a job opening. Now subscribe to this channel, miss, because you need to hear the rest. You need to know what I've become. The two words, your turn, hung in the blood-red gloom, not as a threat, but as a pronouncement. It was a sentence handed down by a judge whose existence I couldn't comprehend, in a courtroom made of crushing water and eternal night. My mind, already a shattered wreck, gave way to the most basic, reptilian instinct that has kept our species alive for millennia: flight. The complex reasoning, the engineering knowledge, the man I had been, all of it was burned away, leaving only the raw, screaming need to escape. The diving bell, my only conceivable sanctuary, was a faint, almost imperceptible blip on my suit's emergency navigation display. It was a long way off. My thrusters, operating on the dregs of the emergency battery, felt weak and sluggish, pushing against a sea that suddenly felt as thick as wet cement. That journey back was a waking nightmare, a traverse through my own personal hell. The world was a canvas of crimson and black. The single weak red emergency light cast long distorted shadows that writhed and danced like living things. The jagged volcanic spires looked like the grasping fingers of buried titans. The gentle fall of marine snow was no longer a benign blizzard. It was a shower of bone dust from countless forgotten victims. My own breath, loud and ragged in my helmet, sounded like the gasps of a dying man. I was convinced I was not alone. The entity was gone, but its presence remained, a stain on the darkness itself. Out of the corner of my eye, in the deepest shadows just beyond the reach of the red light, I kept seeing it, a flicker of impossibly fluid motion, the long, sinuous shape that had haunted my periphery, now pacing me like a shark circling a bleeding swimmer. When I would snap my head to look, there would be nothing there but the oppressive, featureless void. Was it real? Or was my mind now completely untethered from its rational anchors, simply populating the darkness with the architecture of my own terror? In that moment, the distinction no longer mattered. The suit's emergency systems were failing. A low oxygen warning began to flash on my display, a tiny red icon blinking in rhythm with my own frantic heartbeat. My limbs felt heavy, my thoughts growing fuzzy and slow. A strange sense of calm, the insidious precursor to asphyxiation, began to settle over me. Part of me, a deep, exhausted part, wanted to give in, to stop fighting, to simply switch off the emergency power, hang there in the silent, peaceful dark, and let the abyss claim me. It would be so easy. But then the image of Sarah's face, her real face, smiling in the sunlight of our backyard, flashed in my mind. It was a memory so pure, so potent, it was like a jolt of pure oxygen to my soul. It was a memory the thing in the dark could imitate, but could never truly possess. And it was for that memory that I fought. I pushed the thrusters to their maximum, ignoring the screaming power drain alarms, my entire being focused on the single, desperate goal of reaching that blip on my screen. The docking port of the diving bell, when it finally materialized out of the red gloom, was the most beautiful sight I had ever witnessed. It was salvation, rendered in welded steel. With the last dregs of my strength and the final gasp of my battery, I slammed into the docking ring. The magnetic clamps engaged with a series of loud, resonant thuds that were like the tolling of church bells. I was home. I was safe. The agonizingly slow process of equalizing the pressure between the bell and the antechamber began. The hiss of gas was a symphony, the song of my return to a world of air and life. I could feel the terror beginning to recede, replaced by a wave of relief so profound it was physically debilitating. I had survived. I had faced the impossible, and I had survived. I had a story to tell, a warning to give. I would expose the corporation. I would tell the world what was really down here. My mind raced with plans, with the future, a future I had been certain, just moments before, that I would not have. When the inner hatch finally swung open, I practically fell through it, collapsing onto the grated floor of the dive prep chamber. I fumbled with the seals on my helmet, my hands shaking so violently I could barely function. I twisted the locking ring, pulled the helmet free, and took my first deep shuddering breath of the can's familiar recycled air. It tasted like heaven. I staggered to my feet and pushed through the door into the main living quarters, expecting to find it empty, a silent testament to the partner I had lost. But the chamber was not empty. The main lights were on, casting a warm, normal glow on the familiar space. And sitting at the small metal table, a steaming mug of coffee held in his hands, was Marcus. He looked up at me as I stumbled in. He was not pale or terrified. He was not the ghost of a man I'd been sharing this can with for weeks. He looked rested, calm. There was a faint, serene smile on his lips. His worn, creased face was relaxed. He looked younger, the crushing weight of 2 decades spent in the abyss seemingly lifted from his shoulders. "You made it back," he said, his voice the normal rumbling tone I remembered from my first few dives, the high-pitched helium squeak completely gone. The air pressure, it was normal. "You were quicker than I was. Took me nearly an hour to get back to the bell my first time." My mind simply refused to process the scene. It was a paradox, a glitch in reality. "Marcus," I whispered, my own voice a raw, croaking thing. You're alive. I saw you. It cut your umbilical." "You were gone." He took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving mine. But his eyes, they were wrong. The weariness, the fear, the soul-deep exhaustion I had known. It was all gone. What was left was a placid, unnerving emptiness. It was the serene, contented look of a man who no longer has any worries in the world because he no longer has a world to worry about. "What you saw was part of the final interview, Leo," he said, his voice gentle. "A practical demonstration. They had to be sure you had what it takes." "Interview?" I stammered, my legs giving way as I slumped against the bulkhead. "What are you talking about? What is they?" "The landlords," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "The original inhabitants, the old ones. We call them the landlords." He gestured vaguely at the curved walls of the can. "This entire ocean, it's their property, and they are very particular about who they allow to operate on it. Those cables we spend our lives maintaining. All that light, all those data pulses, all that electromagnetic noise. To them, it's like 1,000 screaming sirens going off in their silent, peaceful home, day and night. It irritates them." He leaned forward, his empty eyes seeming to look right through me. "A long time ago, a deal was struck. The company gets to lay its cables, to run its global nervous system through their territory. But in exchange, the landlords required a mediator, a liaison, a caretaker, someone who understands both worlds, someone who can manage the property and ensure the tenants." He gestured at the cables in his mind's eye. "Don't get too loud." The pieces of the puzzle, the fragmented warnings, the impossible events, began to slot into place, forming a picture of such monstrous cosmic horror that I felt my mind begin to unravel completely. "The rules," I whispered. "The list. It's not a safety manual, Leo," he said with that serene, terrible smile. "It's a job application. It's an aptitude test. They've been watching you since your first dive. They watch everyone. The tapping on the helmet, a test of discipline and the ability to ignore distractions, the phantom lights, a test of your adherence to protocol over sensory deception, the voices, the faces in the dark, a test of your psychological fortitude, and a way for them to sample your emotional attachments." He took another sip of coffee. "Most candidates fail. They panic. They go insane. They get sloppy and have accidents. But you were different. You were curious. You were defiant. You broke the rules not out of panic, but out of a need to understand. You looked. You investigated the archives. You confronted the source directly. Those are not the qualities of a good employee, Leo, but they are the exact qualities they look for in a new caretaker." The word hung in the air, cold and heavy as a tombstone. Caretaker. "Marcus," I said, my voice breaking. "What happened to you? What are you?" "I'm retired," he said, a genuine note of relief in his voice. "My term is up. I served my time. The creature you saw out there, the thing in the old suit, That was the hiring manager. It wears a different face for every candidate. For you, it wore your wife's voice. For me, it was my brother who drowned when we were kids. It finds the deepest hook, and it pulls. I was the final part of your test. My death was your final problem to solve. You survived. You passed. The full crushing weight of the revelation settled upon me. This wasn't an escape. This chamber wasn't a sanctuary. It was the manager's office. I hadn't survived a horror. I had been promoted into it. My life on the surface, my home, Sarah, it was all gone. A memory from a different life that was no longer mine. I was not going back, ever. I was a permanent fixture of this place, a ghost in the machine. Physical survival had been granted, but my soul, my hope, my very future had been the price of admission. The final piece clicked into place. Alistair Finch's last, desperate warning cut short by that terrible sound. The final rule, it's a lie. It's not for our protection, it's for... I finally understood. It wasn't for their protection. It was for the company's. A way to select a replacement without ever admitting the truth. As if on cue, a soft chime sounded from the computer terminal in the corner. Marcus nodded towards it. "That's for you," he said. "Your first official duty." With legs that felt like they were made of lead, I walked over to the screen. A new work order was displayed, the text glowing in a calm, professional green. It read, "New dive team. Replacement for M. Kanan, L. Bishop. Arriving on station in 24 hours. Prepare for their saturation cycle. Your first task is to ensure they are properly briefed," and next to the work order, a single file was attached. I clicked it open. It was a clean digital copy of the list. The rules. My tenure had begun. My job was not to fix the cables. It was to maintain the system, to find my own replacement, to listen for the tapping, to watch for the lights, and to wait for the next curious soul who was brave and foolish enough to look. I turned away from the screen and looked through the thick quartz of the viewport, out into the eternal waiting darkness. For the first time, it didn't look empty. It looked expectant. My story is over, but a new one is about to begin. The only question is, whose will it be?